The sound of a car engine revving outside broke the early morning silence. I pulled the blinds aside, expecting to see a neighbor's car parked as usual, but what I saw made my blood boil. There it was, Karen Mitchell's SUV, parked squarely in the middle of my driveway, blocking me. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the absurdity. The driveway I had spent so many quiet mornings backing out of, the same one that led to the place that was supposed to give me peace, was completely blocked by her SUV. I couldn't believe it, not again. My name's Michael Blake. A year ago, I was burning out on 12-hour shifts as a project manager in Houston's energy sector. When my father passed, I inherited Blake Ranch, and with it, the very driveway that was now blocked by Karen's SUV. I thought moving back here would bring peace. Turns out, I was walking straight into war. I grabbed my keys and stormed out the door, fury rising with every step. There it was again, the constant reminder of the power Karen and the HOA had over this neighborhood. She had to know exactly what she was doing, and the way she parked, not even bothering to leave room for me to get through, told me all I needed to know. This was personal. I walked up to her SUV, and sure enough, Karen was inside, her attention glued to her phone, as if the world wasn't quite literally in her way. I knocked on the window and she looked up, her smug grin spreading across her face like it always did when she knew she had the upper hand. "Morning, Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice level, though the frustration crept in around the edges. "You mind moving your car? You're blocking my driveway." She didn't budge. In fact, she barely reacted. The smile didn't falter. "Oh, Michael, I'm sorry, but the HOA has decided this is community property now. You'll need to park somewhere else or you'll be fined." My head spun. Community property? Was she serious? I leaned down to meet her gaze, trying to keep my composure. "This is my property, Karen," I said, calm but with an edge of steel in my voice. "Not the HOA's. You can't just park here and make up your own rules." She just shrugged, her smile never wavering. "Well, I'm just doing my job, Michael. I'm making sure things are in order around here. It's for the neighborhood's benefit after all." I felt the frustration building in my chest, but I managed to take a deep breath. "Move your car, Karen, now." As I turned back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her blocking my driveway. This was about Karen once again pushing her weight around, trying to control everything around her. I'd had enough. And this wasn't the first time Karen's antics had gotten out of hand. No, it wouldn't be the last. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, because you're about to see exactly what happens when an HOA tries to take control of the wrong driveway. I've always considered myself a peaceful person. I wasn't one for drama, never sought out conflict. Life had always been simpler back in the ranch, before the HOA and their constant meddling. My dad used to tell me that peace came from having control over your surroundings, your home, your property, your space, and that's exactly what I'd come back to after years of corporate hell. When I inherited Blake Ranch after my father passed, I thought it would be a return to simplicity, a chance to breathe. But when I pulled up that long gravel driveway for the first time in years, I had no idea what I was walking into. I thought the HOA was just a bunch of busybodies with too much time on their hands, you know? All those rules about lawn height and mailbox colors, I was prepared for that. Thought I could ignore them and live my life in peace. What I didn't expect was Karen Mitchell. She was the vice president of the Maple Crest HOA, and the minute I met her, I could tell she was trouble. The first incident was about the color of my fence. Apparently, I needed to repaint it because it didn't meet HOA standards. Karen sent me a letter, cold and impersonal, demanding compliance. It seemed harmless enough at first, a little inconvenience. I figured, okay, whatever, it's just a coat of paint. But it didn't stop there. Next, Karen told me I had to trim back my trees. Then it was the flowers in my front yard. Every time I thought I was getting settled, she'd send another letter, another fine. The woman had no sense of personal space, no respect for anyone's boundaries. I tried to handle it calmly, but Karen, she was relentless. And it wasn't just about rules anymore, it was about control. Karen had made it her mission to assert her authority in every corner of Maple Crest, and I was no exception. She started showing up unannounced, knocking on my door with complaints about my grass being too tall or the wrong kind of mulch. She would walk through the neighborhood like she owned the place, her eyes darting from yard to yard, constantly searching for something to criticize. I remember one time she stood in front of my house for nearly an hour just staring at my driveway, calculating, measuring. And this wasn't just her. No, Karen had managed to rally a few other like-minded individuals on the HOA board. It was clear this wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood. This was about wielding power. One day I finally snapped. My neighbor Ray was in his front yard, chatting with his wife when Karen walked by, clipboard in hand. She casually pointed at Ray's property and muttered something about excessive lawn ornaments, just loud enough for everyone to hear. That was when I saw the real Karen. Not just the self-righteous board member, but the woman who thought her opinion was law. The woman who looked at neighbors as pawns in her game of control. I remember the first time she showed up in my yard with a clipboard. I had just finished mowing the lawn, barely had time to grab a cold drink before she marched up to me, all smiles, but her tone was anything but friendly. "Mr. Blake," she began, holding her clipboard like a weapon, "I'm afraid your fence is in violation of Section 4, Paragraph 7 of the HOA bylaws. We'll need it painted within the next 10 days. I didn't have time for this nonsense. "Karen," I said, my voice steady, "it's not my fence. It's part of my property, my family's property. We've maintained it like this for years. I'm not repainting it just because you say so." She looked at me like I was the one who had overstepped. "I'm just doing my job, Michael. The HOA takes these things seriously." That's when I realized this wasn't just about the rules anymore, it was personal. It wasn't about keeping the neighborhood looking nice. It was about Karen asserting her control over every aspect of my life. She wasn't just the HOA vice president, she was the one holding the pen, the one issuing the orders. And for the first time, I thought, enough is enough. This driveway, this property, it wasn't just land to me, it wasn't just about having a roof over my head. This was the last place that belonged to me, to my family. When my father passed, it was more than just the house that I inherited. It was the legacy, the connection to a past that had been built with sweat and hard work. This driveway was more than just an entrance. It was my last refuge from the madness of the HOA. The place I came to for peace was now under siege. And Karen, with her smug smile and her constant demands, had made it clear that no matter how hard I tried to avoid conflict, it was going to follow me. I wasn't just going to sit back anymore, I was ready to fight, and Karen, well, she had just picked the wrong person to mess with. The moment Karen looked at me through the windshield with that same smug grin, something inside me snapped. I was done asking, done being polite. This time, I was going to make her understand. I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. As the ringing tone echoed in my ear, I watched Karen sit there, totally unfazed, scrolling through her phone like she wasn't blocking someone's driveway in the middle of their morning routine. When the officer answered, I wasted no time. "Hi, yes, I'm Michael Blake. Someone has parked in my driveway and refuses to move. I've asked nicely, and now I need help." It wasn't even 2 minutes before Karen finally noticed the change in my demeanor. The moment I hung up the phone, she rolled down her window, that self-satisfied smirk never leaving her face. "Michael," she said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy, "you really don't have to go through all this trouble. I'm just following the rules, you know. The HOA has declared this area community property. I'm well within my rights." The nerve. She had no idea how far off base she was. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of concrete and gravel. I was fighting for my sanity, for some semblance of control over my own life. "You're blocking my driveway, Karen," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage, despite the boiling anger rising in my chest. "I've asked you twice now to move, and you refuse. That's not following the rules. That's being a bully." She sighed dramatically, pushing her sunglasses up her nose. "Oh, Michael, don't make this difficult. I'm just trying to keep everything running smoothly. If you want to avoid a fine, I suggest you comply. There are plenty of people who'd be more than happy to see your driveway become a designated space for the community." Her words were condescending, dismissive, like she knew the power she held over people who were too afraid to stand up to her. It was the same tone she used at every HOA meeting, the same tactic of wearing people down until they caved, and I knew deep down that she thought this was no different. But I wasn't like the others. I wasn't going to sit back and let her push me around. I glanced toward my neighbors, hoping for some kind of support, some sign that I wasn't alone in this. A few people stood in their yards watching the scene unfold, but no one moved. No one said a word. There was Ray across the street, his arms folded, watching from his porch. I could see the guilt in his eyes, but he didn't say a thing. It was the same with the others. They watched, some with curiosity, others with uncertainty, but not one of them dared to speak up. Karen was the one who had control over the neighborhood. She had been in the HOA long enough to know how to manipulate the situation, how to get people to fall in line. The fear of consequences, fines, notices, and maybe even legal action had silenced them. I was completely isolated, and it hit me like a punch in the gut. Here I was, fighting for my rights, and the entire neighborhood was standing by, too afraid to help. But that only made my resolve stronger. If I couldn't count on my neighbors, I'd have to count on myself. The officer arrived soon after. He stepped out of his cruiser, taking a long look at Karen's SUV and then at me. I could tell he was trying to figure out what was really going on. But Karen, ever the manipulator, had already begun spinning her version of events. "Officer," she said, her voice sugary sweet, "I'm just following the HOA's directives. Mr. Blake here is causing a scene for no reason. I'm just trying to park in a way that benefits the community." The officer didn't seem convinced. He took a step closer to Karen's car, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Ma'am, you're blocking his driveway. That's not following the rules. You're making it difficult for him to get to his property. Are you going to move the vehicle?" She looked at him as if he'd just asked her to break the law. "I'm afraid I can't do that," she replied, her lips curling. "It's within the HOA's right to use these spaces for community purposes. I'm sure Mr. Blake can find another way out." The officer hesitated, clearly caught in the middle of a neighborhood dispute, but he could see the situation for what it was: Karen's blatant overreach. He glanced at me and then at her SUV. "Ma'am, you need to move the vehicle, now." For a second, I thought she might back down, but she didn't. She sat there, staring at the officer like she was untouchable. "Fine," she said, almost reluctantly, "but I'm reporting this to the board. You're going to regret this." I stood there, silent, as Karen finally reversed the SUV, but not without one last venomous glare thrown my way. "This isn't over," she muttered, before driving off. The officer gave me a curt nod, as if to say he'd done his part. "Keep your property clear, sir, and if she pulls this again, you'll have more backing." The moment Karen was out of sight, the flood of emotions hit me: frustration, anger, and a sinking feeling in my stomach. This wasn't just about a blocked driveway. Karen had just shown me that she wasn't going to stop until she had control over everything. I knew then this wasn't something I could just let go. I wasn't going to let her, or the HOA, keep pushing me around. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone. The voicemail from Karen was already in my inbox, and I didn't need to hear it to know what it said. She had left me another condescending message, warning me about the fines I would face for disrupting community harmony and reminding me that she would escalate the issue to the HOA board. I had no intention of listening to it. I had put off dealing with the HOA for months, maybe even years. When I first moved back to Blake Ranch, I was determined not to stir the pot. My father's passing had left a hole, and I thought if I just kept my head down and minded my own business, I could rebuild the peace I'd lost in Houston. I'd been burned out by the corporate world, and this place, my family's land, was supposed to be a refuge. But Karen had a way of breaking down your defenses, piece by piece. It wasn't just about the driveway anymore. No, it had become something bigger. This was her way of exerting control over everything. She wasn't just interfering with my property, she was trying to push me out, make me bend to her rules. I was done letting it happen. I picked up the phone and dialed the number I knew could give me a fighting chance. Emma Porter, a sharp, no-nonsense environmental lawyer I'd gone to college with. She had helped me with a few minor legal things in the past, but I knew this was going to be different. "Hello?" Her voice came through clear and confident. "Emma," I said, my voice tight. "It's Michael Blake." "I know who it is," she replied, sounding a little amused. "What's up?" "I need help. I'm dealing with this HOA mess, and it's not just the usual stuff anymore. Karen Mitchell, she's been coming after me, making ridiculous demands, and I'm done trying to work things out. I need to take legal action." There was a brief pause on the other end. I could almost hear her shifting in her seat, thinking it over. "Tell me everything," she finally said, her tone shifting to business mode. "What's the situation?" I explained it to her: the blocked driveway, the incessant notices, the fines for nothing. I told her how Karen had tried to control everything from my landscaping to my mailbox color, how she'd bullied my neighbors into silence, and how every attempt at peaceful resolution had been met with mockery. Emma listened patiently, and when I finished, she didn't skip a beat. "Okay, we'll need to gather some evidence. I'll need copies of the HOA bylaws, any notices or letters from Karen or the board, and any evidence of these fines. But more importantly, I'll need your neighbors' testimonies." I sighed. That's going to be a problem. No one's willing to speak up. Karen's made sure of that. Emma's voice was unwavering. "That's fine. We'll work around it. If we can't get people to speak out now, we'll still gather the data. We'll track her every move. Let me start pulling things together on my end. You focus on collecting everything you have. We'll hit them hard." The determination in her voice was exactly what I needed to hear. She wasn't going to back down, and neither was I. Not anymore. I ended the call, feeling a little lighter, but also heavier. This was it. The gloves were off. Over the next few days, I dug through every piece of paperwork I had. I didn't have much: Just a few notices from Karen, emails from the HOA board, and a series of recorded phone calls that I had started keeping after Karen's increasingly ridiculous threats. I scrolled through my inbox, searching for the email where Karen had once again demanded that I conform to her idea of neighborhood standards. She had sent a list of bylaws, many of which didn't apply to me at all. But that didn't stop her from threatening to fine me for everything from unapproved flowers to the wrong kind of bird bath. I had saved the emails, each one more absurd than the last. It felt like I was collecting evidence for a case that had been building for months. When I found the right email, I forwarded it to Emma. She had already started reaching out to a few other lawyers for backup, but I knew I needed more than just legal advice. I needed a plan. I couldn't let this go on any longer. As I looked over the documents, something hit me. I had always thought I could avoid conflict. When Karen first started her little crusade, I thought if I just ignored it, it would go away. I was wrong. This wasn't about the driveway or the flower bed or the mailbox. It was about control. It was about Karen trying to turn my home into something she could manage. Something she could rule. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about fighting Karen. It was about reclaiming what was mine, my property, my life, my peace. I wasn't going to sit back and let her tear it all down just because she thought she could get away with it. I stood up from the table, pacing around the kitchen. I had spent too many nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had let things get this far. But I wasn't that man anymore. This was it. It wasn't just about a blocked driveway anymore. It was about taking back control over my life, my property, and my peace. Karen had made this personal, and now it was time to make her feel the consequences. The courtroom was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the polished wood of the judge's bench. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded in front of me, trying to stay calm. Karen Mitchell sat across from me, smug as ever, with her attorney, Miss Holloway, whispering into her ear. She looked completely at ease, like this was all just a formality, but I could see the tension in her eyes, the flicker of unease that betrayed her confidence. The judge, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes, glanced down at the papers in front of him before fixing his gaze on the room. "We're here today to settle the dispute between Mr. Michael Blake and the Maple Crest HOA, represented by Miss Karen Mitchell," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "Let's proceed." Karen stood first, her heels clicking against the wooden floor as she approached the bench with her lawyer by her side. She was dressed in her usual power suit, looking like a woman who thought she could control any room she walked into. But this time, she wasn't the one calling the shots. "Your Honor," Karen began, her voice dripping with false sincerity, "I'm here to represent the best interests of the Maple Crest community. The issues raised by Mr. Blake are not just personal grievances, they're matters that affect the entire neighborhood." She paused for dramatic effect, glancing around the room as if to include the unseen audience in her performance. "As vice president of the HOA, I have a responsibility to ensure that rules are followed, that all residents abide by the community standards we've established. And Miss Blake," she continued, her eyes narrowing slightly, "has shown a blatant disregard for these standards, creating division and disrupting the peace." She turned back to the judge, presenting a stack of documents. "We have extensive evidence showing Mr. Blake's refusal to comply with the HOA's guidelines on property maintenance, parking, and general community harmony." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my cool. This was nothing more than a well-rehearsed performance. She wasn't interested in the truth, she was interested in making me look like the villain. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. When Karen finished, it was my turn. I stood up, my lawyer Emma at my side. The weight of the room seemed to press down on me, but I squared my shoulders and walked toward the judge's bench with purpose. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady, "I'm not here to argue the merits of a neighborhood rule book or personal preferences. I'm here because the defendant, Mrs. Mitchell, has overstepped every boundary imaginable in her attempts to control my property, my life, and my peace." I paused, letting my words hang in the air, making sure the courtroom was listening. The issue at hand isn't about HOA rules. It's about a woman who thinks she can run this entire community by making false claims and intimidating anyone who doesn't comply. This isn't just about me, it's about the right of every person here to live without fear of harassment or overreach. I gestured to the evidence in front of me: emails, written threats, audio recordings of Karen's calls. This is the evidence of Karen Mitchell's abuse of power. We have emails where she's threatened fines for arbitrary reasons, messages that show how she's used her position for personal gain, and recorded calls where she blatantly disregards my rights. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. but I could see the flicker of skepticism in his eyes as Karen's lawyer stood and tried to object. "Objection, Your Honor," Mr. Holloway said, his voice cutting through the room. "This is all hearsay, speculative at best. None of this proves anything concrete." The judge held up a hand, silencing him. "We will address that in due time," he said, his voice firm. "Continue, Mr. Blake." I turned back to Karen, who was glaring at me, the mask of authority slipping just for a moment. This is the woman who has made it her mission to bully and control this neighborhood. Her actions have created chaos, not peace, and I won't stand by while she tears apart the community I've worked my whole life to protect. There was a tense silence in the room. I could feel Karen's gaze burning into me, but I didn't look away. I wasn't backing down. The tension in the courtroom thickened. Karen's smugness had all but vanished, replaced by a cold glare. She was still trying to maintain composure, but the cracks were beginning to show. I could tell by the way she shifted in her seat, the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She had underestimated me. She had underestimated how much I was willing to fight for what was right. Emma stepped up beside me, ready to present the next piece of evidence. The air was thick with anticipation as she laid out the documents in front of the judge, carefully pointing to each one. "Your Honor," Emma began, "we have multiple instances where Mrs. Mitchell, acting in her capacity as the vice president of the HOA, has overstepped her legal authority. These are emails between Mrs. Mitchell and Miss Blake, as well as recorded phone conversations where she actively threatens fines and punitive actions without any legal basis. In addition, we've gathered testimonies from neighbors who, despite their fear of retribution, have agreed to share their experiences of Karen's intimidation tactics." She held up a few printed pages, each one filled with Karen's harsh words, promises of consequences, and orders that went well beyond her legal rights. There was silence as the judge carefully examined the evidence. I could feel the tide beginning to turn in my favor. The judge's face remained impassive, but I could sense the skepticism in his gaze as he turned the pages. Karen's lawyer, Mr. Holloway, stood up to object again, his voice louder this time. "Your Honor, this is all irrelevant. These are merely personal grievances. They don't constitute a breach of law or legal misconduct. There is no evidence of criminal behavior here." Emma calmly turned to him, her voice unwavering. "The issue here, Mr. Holloway, is abuse of power. Mrs. Mitchell has repeatedly used her position to harass and control the residents of Maple Crest, including Mr. Blake. This isn't just about rules, it's about her using the HOA as a tool for personal gain and intimidation." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed with Emma's direct approach. "Mr. Holloway, I think we've heard enough about what you deem irrelevant. Let's move on to the testimonies." I could feel the weight of the room shift as several of my neighbors, who had been silent until now, were called to testify. They stood hesitantly, one by one, each of them looking a little nervous, but also determined to tell the truth. Ray was the first to speak. He stood up from the back of the courtroom, his hands shaking slightly but his voice strong. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 15 years. I've never had any issues with my property until Karen started making these demands. The rules she tries to enforce aren't even in the HOA bylaws. I've gotten fines for having a lawn chair out too long, and one time she told me my tree was too tall. It's not even in my yard, it's in my neighbor's yard. I've been too scared to speak up until now, but I can't stand by and watch someone like Karen run this place like a dictatorship." There was a murmur in the room. Karen's face had turned pale as she listened, her eyes darting back and forth as if trying to control the narrative, but Ray's words had struck a nerve. Next, another neighbor, Susan, took the stand. She was older, frail, but her voice was steady. "Karen gave me a fine for an expired license plate on my car. The problem was that the car hadn't moved in months. I was waiting for my son to help me fix it. She came over to my house, knocked on the door, and demanded I pay a fine right there on the spot. She threatened me with legal action if I didn't comply. I've never felt more helpless in my life." Susan's voice cracked a little at the end, but it was enough. The room was silent, and I could see the judge's eyes narrowing, clearly upset by Karen's behavior. The tide had turned completely. I looked at Karen, her face was now an ugly shade of red, and her eyes darted between me and my neighbors. I knew she was trying to keep it together, but the cracks were starting to show. The carefully constructed facade of a reasonable HOA president was slipping, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Mitchell, I have to say, I'm not pleased with the evidence presented here. The testimonies, the records, and the threats, all of this points to a clear abuse of power. You've made the lives of your neighbors harder, not easier. This is not what an HOA is meant to do." For the first time, Karen looked genuinely rattled. The judge's words were like a slap to the face, but she didn't back down. She opened her mouth to say something, but the judge cut her off. "I've heard enough. We'll reconvene tomorrow for the ruling." The day after the crushing of Karen's SUV, the world seemed to shift on its axis. What had been a local dispute had suddenly turned into a media storm. News outlets were all over it. TV stations, online articles, even local radio stations were discussing the court case, the ruling, and the symbolism of the SUV being crushed. It was the kind of spectacle that captured everyone's attention, and Karen, for all her arrogance, had become the unwitting star. Karen's reputation, once built on fear and control, began to crumble faster than I could have imagined. Her smug confidence had been shattered in that moment of humiliation, and now the world saw her for what she really was, a bully with a clipboard. I could already hear the whispers in the neighborhood, the quiet conversations that had once been fearful and obedient, now turning against her. People were finally speaking out. The more I watched the news coverage, the more I felt a strange sense of vindication. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced by Karen's reign, everyone who had been forced to comply with the ridiculous rules and fines she imposed without question. Her abuse of power had gone unnoticed for so long, but now it was all out in the open. But then something unexpected happened. By late afternoon, I started getting messages, text from people I barely knew, neighbors, friends of friends, even some old acquaintances from when I first moved into the area. Most of them were apologizing, some admitting they had been too scared to speak up against Karen. They had watched her tear through the community, holding her power over people's heads, and had stayed silent, afraid of the consequences. "I should have spoken up sooner," one message read. "Karen's been making life hell for so long. I'm sorry I didn't see it before. You've opened my eyes." I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for them, but the other part was just glad to see them finally waking up. These weren't just apologies, they were acknowledgments. People were realizing the truth. Neighbors who had once avoided me, keeping their heads down to avoid Karen's scrutiny, started reaching out. It wasn't much, just simple conversations at first, but it was enough. They were apologizing for their silence, telling me they'd had enough of Karen's control. They spoke of how they had been afraid to get involved, but now they could see how wrong she was. Ray was the first one to come over, unannounced, knocking on my door that evening. He looked nervous, hesitant even, but there was sincerity in his eyes. "Hey Michael," he said, shifting on his feet. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not saying something sooner. I never thought she could go this far. I should have stood up for you, but I guess I was scared. Scared of Karen, scared of the HOA. I didn't want to rock the boat." I could hear the regret in his voice, but there was something more, something powerful about how the community had begun to rally. This wasn't just a personal victory for me. It was the beginning of something bigger. The community was starting to wake up to the reality of how they had been manipulated, how they had let one person control everything. But as Ray stood there, I realized something else. This wasn't just about Karen, it wasn't just about the HOA, it was about power, how it could corrupt, how it could silence, and how it could make you feel like you didn't have a voice. That's what Karen had done to us all. She had convinced us that she had the right to dictate our lives. The power she had once wielded so easily was crumbling. As the days passed, the shift in the community was undeniable. The more the story spread, the more Karen's influence seemed to vanish. What had once been her stronghold, her kingdom of fines and complaints, now felt like a hollow shell. I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders with every apology, every message I received, and every conversation that took place. It wasn't just about getting Karen out of my life. It was about changing the entire dynamic of Maple Crest. By the weekend, the community had come together in ways I never thought possible. The once quiet neighborhood started to hold open discussions about the HOA's role and Karen's overreach. The whispers of discontent had turned into full-blown conversation. Even the most timid residents, the ones who had always kept their heads down, began to ask questions, to challenge the status quo. One afternoon, as I walked past a few neighbors' houses, I overheard snippets of conversations. "Did you hear about the fine she issued for a bird bath? Ridiculous. I always thought it was just me, but I see it now. She's been playing us all." It was clear that the whole neighborhood had been under Karen's thumb, and now they were realizing the extent of the manipulation. Ray had been the first to speak up, but now it was more than just him. I saw a shift in people's faces when they saw me walking by. The fear had vanished, replaced by something else. Recognition. People were beginning to understand how Karen had abused her position, and they weren't afraid to stand against her anymore. And then there was the flood of social media posts. The story had gone viral. Local news had picked up on the dramatic image of Karen's SUV being crushed, and the internet ran with it. People from all over the country chimed in with their support, applauding the judgment as a long overdue smackdown against HOA bullies. People shared memes of the Karen SUV with captions like, "When the HOA goes too far." Some had even started using it as a symbol of resistance against HOA overreach in their own neighborhoods. But the most telling part? Karen wasn't just being called out by her peers, she was being called out by the very people who had once supported her. Neighbors who had whispered her praises in the past now turned on her, exposing her lies and manipulations. The facade was gone. The Queen of Maple Crest was no longer untouchable. I spent that weekend reflecting on everything that had happened. I could see how far the community had come, how much they had been silenced under Karen's control, and now how they were reclaiming their voices. It was a strange, bittersweet feeling. I had fought for my own peace, my own property, but this wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been afraid to speak up, who had ever been intimidated by Karen's threats. Looking back, I realized that this fight had forced me to confront something I had been avoiding for a long time, my own fear. I had always thought avoiding conflict was the path to peace, that staying out of people's way would keep me safe, but it wasn't. This whole ordeal had shown me that real peace comes when you stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I wasn't just standing up for my driveway anymore. I was standing up for my right to live without fear, for the right of my neighbors to live without the constant threat of fines and harassment. I was standing up for all of us. This wasn't just a victory for me, I thought, as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless under the thumb of someone like Karen. And as I thought about the future, I realized something else. Karen's influence was gone, and the HOA was never going to be the same. The real work had just begun. It wasn't just about taking down one person, it was about making sure that no one could ever hold that kind of power over us again. The community was beginning to rebuild, to be stronger, to be united, and I had a part in that. The days after Karen's downfall were a blur of change. It wasn't just the immediate satisfaction of watching her power crumble, though that was certainly part of it, but the long-term effects that started to ripple through the entire community. I had expected some resistance from the HOA, but instead, the board was forced to restructure, starting with the removal of Karen and her supporters. The neighbors who had once been silent were now stepping up, organizing meetings and voicing their concerns about the abuses they'd tolerated for years. It was strange at first, the quiet that settled over the neighborhood. Karen's influence was gone, and for the first time I could drive down the street without wondering if I'd be met with a fine or another ridiculous complaint. No one had to walk on eggshells anymore. For the first time in years, we were all free to live as we pleased. I spent the following weeks fixing things around the ranch, small projects that had been put off because I'd been too busy fighting for what should have been mine all along. The fence that Karen had wanted me to repaint, I took my time making it look the way I wanted, with no rules or bylaws to dictate what I could and couldn't do. The trees, once on the chopping block for being too tall, were now left to grow naturally. And the driveway, oh, the driveway. Once a symbol of powerlessness, of Karen's relentless control, now it was just a driveway again. I fixed the cracks, cleaned it up, and made it look the way it had when I first inherited the property. The weight of it, the tension I had felt every time I looked at it, had been lifted. It was just mine again. And for the first time I felt the peace I had come back here to find. The real turning point, though, came when I decided to host a community gathering at my house. It wasn't about me, it was about all of us. It was a symbol of the unity that had begun to grow after Karen's removal. At first I wasn't sure who would show up. So many people had been afraid to speak out, and I had no idea if they were ready to take that next step. But to my surprise, people came. A lot of them. Neighbors I had barely exchanged a word with came over, shaking my hand, offering thanks, and even apologizing for not standing up sooner. It was strange, hearing their apologies, but in a way, I understood. They had been scared, controlled by Karen's threats, and now they were free. Ray was there, of course, his face beaming with a pride I hadn't seen in him before. We set up tables on the lawn, and the whole neighborhood came together, families, old friends, and even new faces I hadn't recognized. It wasn't just a party, it was a celebration. The sense of community I had always dreamed of was finally becoming a reality. The sound of laughter, kids running around, and people sharing stories was exactly what I had missed in all my years of corporate grind. The evening was warm, the kind of peaceful evening that made me grateful to be home. I stood on my porch for a while watching the kids play near the driveway, the same driveway that had once been a battleground. Now it was just a simple path that led to my home, the place where my family's legacy had been preserved, where I could breathe freely. As I looked around at the people, I realized how much had changed. This neighborhood, once divided by fear and control, was now united, and it wasn't just Karen who had lost. It was the fear, the silence, the belief that one person's power could dictate the lives of everyone else. We had reclaimed our space. And then, as the sun began to set and the air turned cool, I thought about everything that had happened, the fight, the struggle, the victory, and I couldn't help but smile. The driveway, I thought, leaning against the railing, once a battleground, was now a symbol of what we could achieve when we stood together. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had been silent, everyone who had been too scared to speak up. We had all won, and as I watched the faces around me, I realized that the change wasn't just in the neighborhood, it was in me too. I had come back to this place looking for peace, but what I found was something much more powerful. I found the strength to stand up for myself, for my neighbors, and for my family's legacy.